The time in which Paul is writing here, marriage was a lot different than you and I are looking at it. In fact, you'll notice several times he will say, I say this, not the Lord, as you have probably read 1 Corinthians before. The reason Jesus didn't say anything about it before is because he didn't experience what Paul's about to experience. And there was no way for him to talk in his lifetime to the people. Remember, Jesus was dealing with Jews who were well acquainted with the Old Testament. So he dealt with them in Old Testament relationship. Now, Paul is over here in Greece. And so now Paul is dealing with Greeks who know nothing of the Old Testament for the most part. And their marriages are much different than marriages understood in Palestine. And so Paul on several occasions will say, I am saying this not by command. That is, Jesus did not give a direct order on this, but as I understand what Jesus wanted and as I understand the Old Testament, this is how I think we ought to handle this problem, if you would. I think it's a timely message for you and for me because in the world in which we live today, we often say marriage is under attack. Marriage is under attack, and we blame everybody for attacking marriage, but really, marriage's strongest defense is the Christian home itself. It cannot be destroyed from outside. No outside force, for example, has been able to destroy the marriage between my wife and I, or your wife and you, and so on and so forth. Those things are taken care of internally. Now, some people will argue that the institution of marriage in America is under attack. But who did the destroying of marriage? Those who were engaged in marriage destroyed it. Paul uses a singular idea throughout, and I want you to take a look at it. Drop down, if you would, to verse 9 in Paul. I'm going to go back. I'm going to cover this in a couple of stages, and then we'll go back and take an overall view at it. But I want you to see the word Paul uses in verse 9. But if any cannot contain, let them marry. What I want you to see is that word marry. That word marry there is written in what we call the aorist tense. Aorist has a beginning but no ending. Throughout chapter 7, when Paul is talking about marriage, yours or mine, he's talking about something that does not end. Now, why is that important? It's important because the time in which Paul wrote, particularly in the city in which Paul is writing. Remember now, this is Corinth. Corinth is an extremely corrupted city. It has a couple of extremist views. Philosophy among the Greeks was huge. And there was what we called the Essenes, and Essenes were an extreme, here the basic underlying message of the Greek culture was that the body, physical life, was extremely sinful. So sinful that the spiritual life would have nothing to do with the physical life. So their argument was, it doesn't matter what I do with my body, because my spiritual self is so separated from my body that it can't be contaminated by anything that I do. So I might as well live, eat, and be merry, for tomorrow I die, and then I start my spiritual aspect. That was their view. And so it tainted everything they did. They had a culture then that didn't look at the here and now as important. They looked at what they thought might be some sort of spiritual awakening after I shed this body. Basically what you and I might call New Age thinking. This is the city in which Paul is preaching. So marriage then was really demoted among the Greeks. In fact, for the most part, men and women would take vacations or timeouts from marriage. Oh, we've been married for a long time. In our culture today, there's been several movies along that line. I remember seeing the commercials for this movie where this family, this husband and wife, they decided they'd take a time out for marriage, and she would run off this direction and he would run off that direction. And that was very commonplace when Paul's writing this letter. and dealing with marriage. The Corinthian church writes to Paul and says, Paul, would you tell us a thing or two about marriage? Because here's what we think. Now, remember what I told you. Where are these Christians coming from? These Christians are coming from the city of Corinth. So naturally, they have their Corinthian viewpoint. And so Paul now has to take the Corinthian viewpoint and bring it around to a Christian viewpoint. America has a secular and American viewpoint. We still hold the Christian viewpoint. The marriage outside the city was legal and tender, but it did not have the understanding or the sanctification that the marriage from those inside the church had. And Paul's going to make this distinction very, very clear. There is a secular marriage and there is a Christian marriage, and Christian marriage and secular marriage are not the same thing. They do not come under the same jurisdiction at all. And Paul understood this. For example, you're going to notice that along with taking these vacations from marriage, which was common in the Greek world, it was also very common for them to divorce. And they could divorce for just about any reason. For example, if you had a different philosophical view, for example, maybe I was somebody who liked the teachings of Plato, and you were more a Socrates type guy. Well, then I could say to my wife, I'm sorry, since you're a Socrates person and I'm a Plato person, we're getting a divorce. And it was understood. In the law, when they went to court and the husband would say, I want a divorce, and the wife would say, well, I don't want one, the judge would say, what's your grounds? Well, philosophically, we're on two different planes. And the court would say, okay. Now, the church writes Paul a letter later on, and he discusses the marriage between a Christian and a non-Christian. And he says if the non-Christian wants a divorce, you have to let them have it. Why? Because they're going to take you to court anyway, and the court's going to grant, based on the fact that you have a Christian philosophy and he has a Greek philosophy. The court's going to go ahead and side with the Greek thinking person anyway, and you're going to lose. So Paul says, let them go if they want to. You can't fight this thing because it's part of this society, and besides, remember, it's secular at that point. They're going to look at marriage from a secular standpoint. Now, what's the Christian standpoint, Paul says? Here's the Christian side of it. You as a Christian can't ask for the divorce. You as a Christian must live with that person and hopefully bring them to Christ. However, if the secular person wants the divorce, you can't stop them because you're going to lose anyway when it goes to court. So let them go. Don't fight. What again, you're going to notice in every one of these arguments, from the very first one, when Paul said, for example, if you go to chapter 1, when he first brings up the issue of marriage, Paul says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Actually, what he says there is it's fair not to get married. Why? Because, and he goes on to explain, under this one condition. Remember now, persecution is coming. And it's not fair for you to marry somebody and bring them into that persecution. So to be fair to a person, it's better for you not to get married right now. But he limits it to this one thing, not that it's better to, and here's one of the problems. So people began to say, well, you mean Paul said it's better if I don't get married? No, he said it's better if you don't get married while this persecution is going on, because she may not, if she's not a Christian person, or if she's a weak Christian person and all of a sudden persecution takes place, she's going to abandon the church anyway and maybe sell everybody out in the process, or he might abandon the church and sell everybody else out in the process. So it's just not a proper time. It's just not a good time right now to put somebody under that kind of a burden, Paul says. So it's not fair. Paul said it's not fair for you to be marrying people and bring them into this kind of persecution right now. Paul was also expecting the second coming of Christ to take place at any moment. And so again, in that same view with this persecution or the soon return of Christ, it may not be wise to bring somebody into that at this particular point. So when he's dealing with marriage, you could see Paul is, and when you read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it's sometimes kind of hard to get your head around this if you don't understand what was going on in the ancient world. Because it sounds like, wow, Paul is saying this and then he's saying that. He really can't make up his mind. The one thing you see in every instant, Paul says, here's what you want to do. You want to think about the other person first. For example, I'm a Christian. I want to marry somebody, but right now may not be a good time because when persecution comes, how fair is it for her to have to deal with my being jailed for speaking out for Christ? How fair is it for her to have to undergo the same persecution that I might go through when she's not ready for that just yet? So is it fair, and that's what Paul uses that word, is it fair for me to bring her into that? If I love her, wouldn't I rather protect her from all of that? See, in love, it's always the other person. Again, coming back again to Paul when he deals with the marriage between a saved and an unsaved person, he says, you must remain in the marriage, but if they want to go, you have to let them go. You can't hold on to them. This isn't slavery. It isn't bondage. It's marriage. And again, Christian marriage is a concept that says once it takes place, it lasts forever. But the Greeks believed that marriage took place, and when I got tired of it, it ended. Much like America thinks today. Until we run out of love for each other, then we're going to separate, right? Marriages, people, when they get married nowadays, are already thinking about when it ends. Well, here, let's sign this document so when this marriage ends, I keep what I got and you keep what you got. And that's how they enter into marriage. It's a very Greek idea. It's a very ancient idea that they have for marriage today. You and I, however, as Christian people, we look at marriage as a union between a man, a wife, and God. It is an agreement that we make with the Lord. Why? Well, I want you to go to verse 17. Because all of that you deal with in chapter 7 really comes down to verses 17 and about down to 24. He's going to sum everything up. He says to us this in verse 17, but as God has distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk, and so I ordain in all churches. Here's the principle that you and I are to live by regarding marriage or whatever question may come up. Because you could see that he's dealing with a lot of things, so he lays down a general principle, and that is this. Every Christian is to be at his post. That is to say, God called you, and God positioned you in this life. God called me. He set out a life for me, which included my particular wife. So my job, my responsibility now, my faithfulness to God is based in my faithfulness to my wife. Then the Lord saw fit to give us our children. So now our lives, our station, our duty, our responsibility has grown because now God saw fit to give us children. And so as God has blessed us with children, then now my duty, my post, my responsibility is to remain faithful with my wife and with our children. And then God went on and gave us grandkids. So again, Terry, you've got to be faithful to your wife. You've got to be faithful with your children. You have to now be faithful to your grandchildren. I haven't moved. I'm standing still. Why? Because I'm at my station that God called me to. That's the whole thing he wants us to understand. Our marriage is really an opportunity for us to serve God. We serve God by serving other people. I cannot directly serve God. I can bow down, I can pray, I can worship, but I can't serve God right now. The way I serve God is by serving those around me. Through marriage, by serving my wife, as a father, serving my children, as a grandfather, serving my grandchildren. This is the station. God has appointed every man his station and his condition in life. That's what Paul wants you to understand. God elevates some people to wealth, Most of us, God keeps just this side of being wealthy. We have sufficient. We have what we have need of, and Christ is faithful to meet those needs. God called most of us to that station in life, where we have the necessities of life, and we could provide for our spouse, we could provide for our children, we can provide for our grandchildren. God has given to most of us that section or that station in life. And what he wants us to do is to be faithful with the things that he has given to us. Faithful with our home, faithful with the automobiles, everything that I have, really God, and this is the view Paul wants us to have the view that God gave it to you. If God gave you your wife and your kids and the things that you have, your home, then what responsibility do you have toward those things except to remain faithful to them? If God has given you a home, then doesn't he expect it to be clean and neat? Doesn't God expect that it should reflect him in some way? Shouldn't it be a place that stands for Jesus Christ? And when people come into our homes, shouldn't they see it as a representative place? It should be just like the church. The church is the house of God. And when you come into my house, it should also be a house of God, because after all, did he not give it to me? Wasn't that my station? That's what Paul is saying here. In all that I have in this particular station, my responsibility, it remains the same. It's my service to God. God has called him in it, Paul goes on to say. We're not all called to the ministry. You're not all preachers. God's not expecting you to jump up and preach a sermon to anybody. He is, however, from time to time expecting me to do that. He expects Nathaniel to come up here and to sing. He expects you and I to do our part to keep the church alive and moving. We've all been called into a separate thing. You don't see it and don't understand it, but your marriage is a calling. Your fatherhood, your motherhood, that's a calling. Grandmahood and grandpahood, that's a calling. Someday God shall call me into great-grandpahood, okay? Those are all a calling. Some people, God may call you to singleness. That's a calling. Whatever your position and place is in life, you were called by God to serve him there. And whatever your duty or responsibility is, God wants to see some reflection of it. Not only am I a pastor, but God has seen fit. I am also, like all of you here, I am also employed. Like so many, I work at a hospital. What's my duty and responsibility there? To represent Jesus Christ the best I can. Why? Because that's the station that God placed me at. Since God placed me at that station so that I might bring honor and glory to him in that place. And the same is true with our marriages. As the world around us says, oh, marriage is under attack, marriage is under attack. Mine's not. And you're to stand there and say, mine's not. You're to stand there and say, this is what God said marriage is, and it still is that way. We still are faithful to each other. We're still raising our children in the name of the Lord. We're still raising our grandchildren in the name of the Lord. That's our station. Marriage isn't under attack by any stretch of the imagination, except by those who are engaged in it. If my wife and I decide to call it quits, then we have attacked our own marriage. And Paul wants us to see we were called, we have a service, we have a place of duty. God requires faithfulness, but as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord has called everyone, so let him walk. All right, God called me to faithfulness. This requires that I be faithful and that I should fulfill all my duties. When I was in the Navy and I took that pledge to uphold the Constitution of the United States and defend it from all its enemies, whether they be internal or external. When the Navy said for me to go, I went, and when they said for me to do this, I did that. Whatever my commander, whatever my captain, whoever was in charge of me at that particular time, whatever they said, that's what we did. When they said, here, get in this particular submarine, we're going that way. I got in that particular submarine and we went that way. When they said, oh, get on that particular ship and go that way, I got on that particular ship and we went that way. When they said, hey, we ain't got no weapons, but the Chinese, the main land of China and the island of Taiwan were fighting each other. And they had no ships in the area, so they put us on an unarmed ship and sent us for 8 days to patrol between two warring parties. Figure that nobody's going to shoot at an American ship at that day and time. So we were the only thing they had. And we weren't even a combat-ready ship. They just stuck us out there, and we patrolled. For 8 days, guess what I did? For 8 days, I went back and forth. All I had on my side was a .45 caliber automatic. That was it. If some ship came at me with a big old 5-inch cannon, I didn't stand a chance, because that 5-inch gun on that ship ain't going to even feel that bullet from a .45 coming at it. That's all we had. But the order was, patrol for 8 days, keep them from killing each other until we can get a bigger ship, a fleet, out there to take its place. Whatever we were asked to do, we did it. That was our duty. That was our responsibility. That was our faithfulness. I didn't get to say, hey, we ain't got no weapons. I ain't going. You're going because you were told to go. You may or may not feel qualified for whatever it is that God's asking you to do, but you have to understand, if God calls you to do something, He's going to enable you to do it. Whatever that something may be. God called my wife and I to have 5 children. Wow, if you had told me that when I was like 19, 20, when I first met my wife, I think I was like 20. We got married, I was about 23 or so. If you'd have told me you're going to be the father of 5 kids, I'd have thought, how in the world? But God's callings are His enablings. God allowed us. God has provided. Our children have all grown up. They were all provided for. They were all cared for because God asked us to do that thing. Our faithfulness in whatever service He gives us to do. And here's the thing, He allows no exceptions. Whether it's in marriage or in parenthood or in whatever responsibility God brings you into, there are no exceptions. You do what God asks you to do when God asks you to do it. That's it. Regardless of circumstance or regardless of what's going on around. My responsibility is to be faithful to God here. My responsibility is to be faithful in my home. If and when my children should act up, it doesn't let me abdicate and say, oh, I got lousy, rotten kids, I better quit. Hey, I'll change my lousy, rotten kids. I'm not going to quit. My grandkids come in, they say, hey, we don't like you for a grandpa. Tough. I'm the only one you got. You're stuck with me. Quitting isn't an option in Christianity. I don't get to decide, I don't like where God put me, therefore I'm going to quit. Faithfulness is required, and He allows no exceptions. You don't get to quit any more than I don't get to quit. And I don't get to quit any easier or better than you. What is it that God called us to do? Be faithful to Him. Each and every one of us serves God in a different way. Each and every one of us has a different faithful requirement. We don't all live the same life. And that's really what Paul was saying here in chapter 7. I can't deal with every single issue because life is too chaotic. So let me give you some general rules. And here's the general rule. Do it for the other person first. In marriage, always put the other person first. Husband, put the wife first. Wife, you put the husband first. When you are looking for a mate, put that other person first. It's always about the other person first. But who comes ahead of everything else? God. How can I have a good marriage if I don't have a good relationship with the Father? Anybody who's been married for any length of time knows that marriage can get tough. Marriage can be hard. My poor wife had to put up with me all these years, right? What gives her the grace to do that? Her relationship with God. If she doesn't have a relationship with God, she can't have one with me. That's where Paul lays the line down. That's what marriage is. It's a Christian marriage. It's not a secular marriage. The church doesn't look at marriage the same way the Greeks do. Now, they had to change their mind. When they first came into the church, they had this Greek viewpoint that marriage was temporary, that marriage could be quit at any moment. So Paul said, no, marriage can't. Marriage has a beginning that doesn't end. So he deals with them and says, listen, you women who are thinking about leaving, and that word leaving right now, it wasn't the idea of divorce, it was that temporary vacation from marriage. And Paul says you don't get to do that because the husband's in charge of you. Oh, and women, in case your husband wants that same vacation, you're in charge of him. So you don't get to do what you want to do in marriage, you get to do what the other person wants. Because it's always about the other. In your relationship to God, who's the most important person? You or the Lord? It's the Lord that's important. God's not my servant. Aren't I supposed to be His? So do I get to dictate to God what I think He should do? No. God gets to dictate to me. But here's the thing. God says He loves me. And He's not going to ask me to do anything that I cannot do. God promised to give me grace to do whatever it is that He calls me to. Paul says the same thing. He says, now let me deal with you widows. Paul also, we believe, was a widow himself. That's why he says, be like I am, when he's dealing with the older widow women. He says to the younger women, listen, hey, if your husband passes away, you should get remarried. But you older widows like me, it's better for us if we remain single. And do the work that God called us to. Our children are grown now. Our grandchildren are grown. So now we have the time, us older folks, we have less responsibility at home. Once I become retired from work, I don't have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go to work. I could instead get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and go to work for the Lord. I don't have to worry about punching in and being there by such and such a time. I will have that opportunity instead to punch in and be wherever the Lord wants me to be at that particular time. And so he says the same thing. You know, those of us who are older now, we don't have those same responsibilities, those same demands on our time now. So now we can serve the Lord more full time. And so he says to them, I think you should be like me. He didn't say that to young people. He said to the young one, listen, it's good that you get married and raise children for the Lord. But as older folks now, let's do this instead. Let's serve the Lord full time, is what he is saying to them. Look at verse 24 where he concludes this with this idea. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called abide with God. Wherever you are stationed, wherever you are, God is there. This is where God chose to meet me. If I go down the street to another place, God didn't promise to meet me there. He said, here's your station. This is where I'm meeting with you. If I want to find the joy of the Lord, it's where God called me to. If God called me to the mission field, and I said, no, I don't want to be a missionary. I think I'll be a local New Testament preacher in some comfortable church there in Ontario. God wouldn't be here with me. And I would not be comfortable, and I would not have the joy. Because God would still be waiting for me on some foreign field. My hope was to go to the foreign field. That's what I thought I was being designed for. But God said, no, I don't want you to be a missionary. I loved my opportunity as a missionary. I had one shot at it halfway around the world. I took it because I thought that's what God was going to call me to, because I just absolutely loved it. But God said, no, that's for somebody else, not for you. But I like that. Yeah, I know you do. I love adventure. I love all that stuff. That's just my natural me. And so God said, well, the natural you needs to be overcome. I'm going to give you a different responsibility. And he kept me here in the States. Right here in good old US of A. I was going to go to foreign fields. I was going to go to places where people had never been before. But God said, not you. I'm going to send somebody else. But I know you want to. And you go off, you have a great time, you'll have all kinds of fun. I want you to serve me instead. And so if I had decided, I ain't going to listen to you, I'm going to go off and do your work for you anyway, I would not have found joy there. I would not have found peace, because that's not where he wanted me. This right here, where I stand today, is exactly where God called me to. And so I find my life to be full of joy in this place. I find myself to be very comfortable with the Lord in this place. Why? Because this is where He meets with me. In my marriage is where the Lord meets with me. With my children is where the Lord meets with me. With my grandchildren, that's where the Lord meets with me. That's my responsibility. That's my calling. And that's what Paul says. When your life is all about other people, whether it be your marriage or your ministry, regardless of what you call your ministry, you all have one. You all have something that God's asking you to do. And your life will not be filled with joy until you listen, hear what He wants you to do, and then go and do it. If your life is one of misery, if your life is one where good seems to come every now and then, but isn't a regular byproduct, then you're not where God called you to be. And you need to listen, or you're not doing the thing that He asked you to do. When we do what God asks us to do, we find our greatest joy. Why? Because He said, that's where I'll meet you. Verse 24 again. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. The word abide means to live with. My wife and I got married. Guess what we did? We moved in together. Right after we were married. I had an apartment already. My wife and I got married. After our wedding, we went over to her parents' house. We celebrated our marriage. I said to my wife, listen, we're going to go on our honeymoon. You wait right here. I'm going to go back to my apartment and change. And she said, I'm going with you. What? Going over to some strange man's house? That's my house now. Right? So we drove on over there. I got my clothes. It was our house now. We abide together. Wouldn't that have been a strange thing if we'd gotten married and I left her at home? And I call her every now and then on the phone and say, hey, how you doing, sweetie? She said, hey, when do I get to come on over? Well, you know, I'm not real comfortable with that idea. No, we got married so we could be together forever. That was the whole idea. Why did God call you? God called you because He wanted you to move in with Him. And some of us yet are still calling God long distance. And we haven't moved in with Him. Oh, we made the commitment. We went, like my wife and I did, we went through the marriage ceremony. 7 o'clock it started. By 7:30, here we are getting married. By 8:30, I'm ready to leave her at her parents' house while I go back to my place. I'm going too. I gave my life to Jesus Christ. When did He want to move in? When I gave my heart to Him, He said, I will come in and abide or live with Him. The moment I said, Lord Jesus, come into my heart and be my Savior, He moved in. No long distance relationship. He said, hey, where you go, I'm going. And I said, Lord, how about wherever you go, I go. I like that idea. The Lord and I have been living together now all these years. Wherever I have been, He has been. Wherever He has gone, I have gone with Him. My wife, the same. When I traveled here, she travels with me. When I traveled there, she travels with me. When we went off to Wisconsin, she went off to Wisconsin. When I moved to Ontario, she moved to Ontario. When we lived in Chino, she lived in Chino. When we were in Norwalk, she was in Norwalk. When I lived in Downey, she lived in Downey. When I was in an apartment, she was there. When I was in a house, she was there. Wherever I have been, she has been. Why? Because we abide together. And that's the same word that Jesus Christ uses with us. He abides with me, and I with Him. That's the secret of marriage, is living together. The hardest thing to do sometimes is living together. But that's what marriage is all about. You ever notice that Jesus calls you the bride? The church, individually, you and I, make up the bride of Christ. What does a bride do? Lives with her husband. Not separate like the Greeks did. Well, I'm taking a vacation from marriage. You can take one too if you want. Oh, great. I'll go off up to the temple where all them hundreds of women are. And I'll go down over to this temple where all the hundreds of men are. And when we're all done celebrating, we'll come back together. That was the Greek idea. How foreign that is to us. But yet how much like our American marriage system today. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Marriage has never been under attack any more than it was back then. And Paul found a way to give us the advice that would make it last. And so he says to you and to me, don't be distracted by what's going on outside. Rather be comfortable with what's going on the inside. Remember this, marriage lasts forever.